Hello, everybody, and welcome back to BioSC 140, Human Physiology. In this video, we're going to cover the respiratory system, S4P2. This is lecture exam 4 material. All right, let's get right into it. So, first off, what does the respiratory system do? What's its purpose? What's the goal? What's its function? The respiratory system performs several essential functions. Now, when the general public thinks of the respiratory system, they think of number one. They think of O2 in and CO2 out. They think of gas exchange. That's correct. That is one of the functions. That is a very important function that the respiratory system does, but it's not the only one. Now, gas exchange, that one's usually pretty easy to remember. For students, we've been talking about it all semester long, and it's what the general public thinks of. They think of good air in, bad air out. I shouldn't necessarily say that because look at all this bad air over here on top of LA, but O2 in, CO2 out. We breathe in O2, we use it for cellular metabolism. CO2 is produced as a byproduct of cellular metabolism of making ATP. CO2 is exhaled then by the respiratory system. Now, since you've been great students all semester and since you've been paying very close attention, you know about number 2 also. You know that the respiratory system plays a very important role in acid-base balance, in maintaining proper pH in our bodies. So CO2, when it's dissolved in water, makes it more acidic. So by regulating CO2 levels, it also regulates the acid levels, the acid-base levels, the pH levels within our bodies. So the respiratory system adjusts CO2 concentrations. The renal system, which we've covered, it adjusts hydrogen ion concentration. So they work together to maintain proper acid-base balance, along with other systems, the buffers in our blood and to help maintain proper pH. The respiratory system also provides immunity. The respiratory system is a door into our body. We're bringing things in and we're letting things out. It's kind of a weak point for bacteria and viruses. And so we need to have a strong immune presence within our respiratory system. Also, our respiratory system's damp and dark and warm. It's got great conditions for many bacteria to thrive. And so we need to have a very strong immune presence within our respiratory system because it's got a lot of ideal characteristics for the growth and propagation of bacteria. Also, look at this guy right here. Think back to fire season in California. You're breathing in all that smog all that smoke during fire season. Remember, it smells like a campfire in California during fire season everywhere. And you're breathing that smoke in. And your body has to have some way of protecting itself from those airborne particulates. This is LA. LA is known for its smog. Your body has to have some way to protect itself. Why is there a mushroom on this slide? Any idea? Why is there a mushroom on this slide? So mushrooms release spores, and spores float in the air, and they can be inhaled. And that's not a good situation. You need to have some sort of a way of protecting yourself from all those airborne particulates, whether it be spores from fungi or smoke from cars or or smog from cars, or smoke from California wildfires. Also, this one seems kind of obvious, what I'm doing right now. Vocalization. Our respiratory system aids in communication. It allows for vocalization. It allows for vocal communication. And it's really important. I mean, let's me have a job teaching you guys like this. So vocalization. So the circulatory systems and the respiratory systems complement each other. So on day one of this class, we talked about how we're going to talk about systems in isolation, but really they all work together. They all function together. Well, the respiratory system, the circulatory system are really closely linked. They really work together to get this job done of bringing nutrients to our tissues and waste products, out of our bodies. So respiratory system brings O2 in, circulatory system picks it up, brings it to where it needs to be, drops off the O2, picks up the CO2, brings the CO2 back to our lungs to be exhaled. So for many slides within this lecture, we'll be talking about the circulatory system and the respiratory system because they work so closely together. So the respiratory system consists of two halves or tracts. Now you've probably heard these terms used before. Upper respiratory tract, lower respiratory tract. I want you to know these. Be ready for 1 or 2 questions on the exam about this anatomy. A question like, which of the following is not a part of the upper respiratory system? Which of the following is a part of the lower respiratory system? Be ready for a test question like that. It's really important to know the vocabulary because there's a good chance you're going to be in a healthcare situation. You're going to be working professionally and somebody's health is on the line, and one of your colleagues is going to say upper respiratory tract, and you need to know what they're talking about, or lower respiratory tract, and you need to know what they're talking about. So the upper is the mouth, nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx. The lower is the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. The lower respiratory tract is extensively branched. It's extensively branched. So we have our trachea, which breaks into primary bronchi, which breaks into smaller and smaller and smaller bronchi. This helps deliver and filter the air to the site of gas exchange. The site of gas exchange is going to be the bronchioles, the very, very tiniest of the bronchioles, but mainly the alveoli. The alveoli, these little sacs down here, the alveoli, is where gas exchange primarily happens, the alveoli. So why do we have this anatomy? Remember, form and function go hand in hand. Well, as you descend the lower respiratory tract, as you get further away from the trachea, you increase the number of tubes and you increase surface area. So by the time you get to the alveoli, there is a huge amount of surface area, a huge amount of surface area. And if you remember back to test 1, Fick's law, surface area and rate of flux, the rate at which something can move across the membrane, are related. You increase surface area, you increase flux. So form and function going hand in hand again. Large surface area, because what's the function? The function is moving gas in and out. If we want to move gas in and out, we got to have a large surface area. Alveoli are the structural / functional unit of the lung. So they do the functional part. They do the gas exchange. Really, the conduits are just aiding the alveoli with what they're doing. So there's 3 main types of cell in the alveoli. You need to know these 3 types for my test, but also there's practical application. There are diseases and situations where you'll hear about type 1 pneumocytes. What do you think a pneumocyte is? So pneumo refers to the lungs. Cyte refers to cell. So a type 1 lung cell. You might hear about a type 2 pneumocyte. Pneumos, lung, cyte, cell. So a type 2 lung cell. There are clinical applications. There are pathologies that affect type 1 and type different. You can have pathology of type 1 cells. You can also have pathology of type 2 cells. And you need to know this. So there's practical application and there's going to be test points. So the alveoli, it wants to bring gas in, bring O2 in and CO2 out. Think back to Fick's law again. We talked about surface area. What else can we do to increase the rate of flux? Well, we can have a thin membrane. Membrane thickness can affect flux. So we're going to have a very thin layer, a single layer of cells on the outside of our alveoli. The type 1, the most common type 1 pneumocytes, are 95% of the cells. And they are the gas exchange cells. Remember, the main thing we want to do is gas exchange. So 95% of our lung cells are type 1 pneumocytes. Their function is gas exchange. Type 2 pneumocytes produce surfactant. Surfactant is a detergent, so it's an amphipathic molecule, and it facilitates breathing because it by lubricating the alveoli and preventing sticking. We don't want our alveoli to get stuck closed. We need them to stay open. We need them to stay inflated like a balloon. So this surfactant helps keep the lungs open, helps stop them from kind of sticking together. It keeps them open, makes it so that they can move. Remember, you need to expand your thoracic cavity, then contract your thoracic cavity, expand your lungs and contract your lungs in order to respire, in order to breathe. And so it needs to have some lubrication, and the type 2 cells produce that lubrication. It helps equalize pressure between different alveoli and ensure equal air distribution. One clinical application of these type 2 cells are premature babies often have underdeveloped type 2 cells that are not producing enough surfactant. And so one major issue with premature babies that are born too early, is respiratory distress syndrome. They're not able to inflate their lungs. Their lungs are like a balloon with no air in it. They're kind of stuck, and they have trouble opening those alveoli up. And it's due to insufficient function of type 2 cells. The third cell that we have are macrophages. So macrophages, we've heard about them before. They're the big eaters. They are the immunity cells. And we have a lot of them in our lungs. There's a lot of lymphatic tissue in our lungs also, for a few reasons, but one is, immunity. So a lot of macrophages. So the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli are the closest adjacent cells in the human body. The alveolar capillary distance is the shortest in the human body. This distance is highly regulated. So the interstitial space, that's what we're talking about. Remember, the thinner the membrane, the higher the flux. So we want a thin membrane. This interstitial space, this space between the endothelium, between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveolar space, it's very, very narrow. It's a very narrow interstitial space, which allows for fast gas exchange between the two. This small interstitial space, in part, is maintained by what I just talked about, the low hydrostatic pressure and large lymphatic drainage in the lungs to prevent fluid buildup or pulmonary edema, which hinders exchange. Pulmonary edema is something that's not good and something that you need to be aware of. And you need to know why it's bad, because pulmonary edema, it's something you hear about in the healthcare world. And you might have even heard about it in just daily life. But in the healthcare world, you'll definitely hear about pulmonary edema. If you have too much fluid in your lungs, if you have too much fluid in your interstitial space, it decreases your ability to move oxygen in and CO2 out, which is not a good thing. Pulmonary edema. Gas diffusion is described by Fick's law. So here's a reminder of Fick's law. We've talked about how surface area, we increase surface area so that we can increase flux, and we decrease membrane thickness so that we can increase flux. Here's a good test question, a good practice question. Just thought of this off the top of my head. With regards to Fick's law, what two variables, or how does your body choose two variables from Fick's law and describe how your respiratory system utilizes these two variables to increase flux? Well, large surface area, increase flux. Membrane thickness, they decrease membrane thickness, increases flux. So our respiratory system involves five phases. We need to transport. So this is kind of big picture stuff. What is the journey? What is the journey that O2 and CO2 need to go on? Well, first step in the journey is ventilation. We need O2 to move from the atmosphere into our lungs. That's ventilation. Ventilation is bringing oxygen, bringing O2 into our lungs. We then need external respiration. The process in term of external respiration revolves to O2 moving across that alveolar membrane and into our pulmonary capillaries. Alveoli to blood, external respiration. We then need gas transport. This is circulatory system stuff. So moving O2 through our circulatory system to the cells that need it is gas transport. Internal respiration is then going to be O2 leaving our circulatory system and going into the tissues. And then cellular respiration is those cells need to utilize that O2 in order to make ATP. So that's the journey of oxygen. It needs to go through all five of those steps in order to get what we want in the end, which is ATP. When that ATP is produced, it produces CO2 also. Well, let's take this backwards. We need to do internal respiration for CO2. So we need to have CO2 go from the tissues to our bloodstream. We then need to do gas transport for our CO2, transport it back to our pulmonary capillaries. We then need to do external respiration for our CO2, CO2 from pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. We then need to do ventilation for our CO2, which is alveoli out into the atmosphere. So respiration has five phases. I expect you to, I recommend practicing telling this story. This is kind of big picture goal. And everything else we're talking about is kind of like details around how we get this done. So be able to tell this story, know the five phases. All right. Pressure. Pressure is caused by molecular collisions. Pressure is caused by molecular collisions. In this picture, we have 5 red dots, 5 red gas dots. In this picture, we have 5 red gas dots. They're bouncing around this container. And every time they hit the wall of this container, they increase pressure, they cause pressure. Well, let's decrease the volume of this chamber. If we decrease the volume of this chamber and these 5 dots continue to bounce around, they are going to hit the walls of the chamber more often. This is the molecular reason why Boyle's law is Boyle's law. Why, when we decrease volume, we increase pressure. Decrease volume, increase pressure at a constant temperature. So here's Boyle's law. Expect a test question on Boyle's law. You need to know Boyle's law. Pressure is equal to 1 over volume at a given temperature. Boyle's law explains how we get gas, how we get air to move into our lungs and out of our lungs. So we have our lungs, we have our diaphragm, which is a muscle. It's like a dome-shaped muscle. When we contract our diaphragm, we increase the volume of our lungs. When we contract our diaphragm, we increase the volume of our lungs. If we increase the volume of our lungs, we decrease the pressure. Now, why would we want to decrease the pressure? Why would we want to decrease the pressure in our lungs when we want to inhale? Because things flow from high pressure to low pressure. So we decrease the pressure in our lungs. There's higher pressure in the atmosphere, lower pressure in our lungs. Air moves from the atmosphere into our lungs. When we want to exhale, we relax our diaphragm, which contracts, constricts, decreases the volume of our lungs. You decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. Higher pressure in our lungs, lower pressure in the atmosphere. Air moves out of our lungs into the atmosphere. Now, inhalation is an active process. It uses ATP. Exhalation is usually a passive. Exhalation can definitely be active. I mean, just think about blowing out birthday candles. You can do active exhalation, but generally, when you're just relaxing, inhalation is active. Exhalation, is a pretty passive thing. So, inhale, contract diaphragm, increase volume, decrease pressure. Things flow from high pressure to low pressure. Air moves into our lungs. Exhale, relax the diaphragm, passive, decreases volume, which increases pressure. Things flow from high pressure to low pressure. Air moves out of our lungs into the atmosphere. All right. So we are now going to talk about how gas moves from the alveoli into our bloodstream. So what dictates the movement of gas from the alveoli, from a gaseous state, into our liquid bodies, into our capillaries, into our blood? How does gas make that jump from gas to dissolved gas and vice versa? So, gases move to pressure, not concentration differences. Now, concentration helps affect pressure. You'll see what I'm saying. But it's the same thing I've been saying for months now. Things go from high pressure to low pressure, even when looking at gas moving from a gaseous state in our alveoli to a dissolved state within our bloodstream. So this is going to make sense. We're going to get this. So Dalton's law. You got to understand Dalton's law to understand how this happens. So Dalton's law says that total pressure is equal to the pressure of gas 1 plus the pressure of gas 2 plus the pressure of gas 3, dot, 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 dot. It could also be written as the partial pressure of gas X is equal to the percent of the whole, so the concentration, percent of the whole, well, I guess not concentration, but percent of the whole of gas X times the times the total pressure. So partial pressure of gas X is equal to what percentage is that gas 10% of the total? Is that gas 30% of the total? Is that gas 50% of the total? So percent of the total for that gas times total pressure. Gas movement is driven by partial pressure differences. By partial pressure differences. You need to understand, you need Dalton's law to calculate these partial pressure differences. Partial pressure is, you have a bunch of gases in the atmosphere. And you have a total pressure of your atmosphere. What is oxygen's contribution to that total pressure? You have a bunch of gases in the atmosphere. Let's look at carbon dioxide specifically. What is the contribution of